mischaracterization of victims, systematic failure in addressing child sexual abuse, institutional bias, the misimplication of the concept of consent and how it has allowed abuse to persist. Welcome back to Riks Europe, Jo Bartosch, journalist with words in Spiked, The Telegraph, The Times, assistant editor at the Critic and co-writer of the book Pornocracy.
Hello.
So you wrote about this in The Spectator with the title The Delusions of Consent. There you're drawing attention to this very tragic case of Lucy Lowe and the broader history of systematic failure in addressing grooming gangs. How do you think historical attitudes towards child sexual abuse and the concepts like consent have influenced the way these crimes have been handled in the past and presently, perhaps?
Yeah, I think there were probably several factors which came into play as to why these particularly vulnerable young women and girls, children, weren't respected, why their sort of autonomy wasn't seen as in any way relevant. And we know that the police dismissed them as essentially as being child prostitutes, which is obviously a contradiction in terms and an absolute moral failing on their part. So these tended to be very poor, white working class girls from deprived areas with quite often quite troubled backgrounds, and that's why they were picked off. That's why they were sort of considered disposable by the authorities, and obviously there was a racial element as well. And I think the attitude of the Muslim Pakistani grooming gangs who targeted them was that essentially because they were outside of their community, these girls were disposable. And sadly, and to their shame, I think the police and the authorities are very much colluded with that attitude because, these girls had no power. They had very few people advocating for them. There was a Labour MP who tried to raise it. She was... years ago, about 20 years ago, she was sort of hounded for it. They were accused of being racist if they tried to draw attention to something that actually, yes, was about race, but was also about class and obviously about sex. So I think there's been a push within social work over the past sort of few decades to look at the idea of consent as a magic word. So the social workers would look at these girls who had been groomed, who, quite often hadn't got a lot of love or a lot of stability in their lives. And they looked at these abusive men who gave them gifts and made them feel special. And they referred to them as their boyfriends. And they weren't their boyfriends. These were abusive adult men preying on children. But the reason I think they looked at them as their boyfriends or dismissed it, I think, firstly, it's psychologically easier to sort of go with that narrative because it makes you feel, I suppose, less. I suppose it makes you feel less culpable. It makes you feel more secure if you sort of dismiss it and if you ignore it. I mean, I think you see the same phenomenon quite often when a woman accuses a man of rape. Quite often, if it's within a friendship group or something, you will quite often have her experience dismissed. And I think there's a reason for that. And I think the reason is that it makes us all feel quite insecure, and it makes us all feel quite vulnerable if we acknowledge the scale of brutality and of violence. So I think that was part of it. And more broadly, I think there's a real fetishization, if you like, of the idea of consent, of being able to consent to extreme BDSM practices or to prostitution or to, we've seen recently on OnlyFans, women like Lily Phillips and Bonnie Blue sort of essentially monetizing their own sexual torture. And we look at their consent, and every time anybody tries to raise this or suggest that perhaps there might be more going on leading to why they might consent to these actions, the focus is always on them, not on what's led them to consent or to seem to consent. So, for example, we know that there's a strong link between being abused as a child and ending up in the sex industry. So within pornography, in fact, there was a Swedish study of last year of 120 performers, and 88% of them had suffered sexual abuse as children. And I think that sort of shows that there's a real pipeline between being abused as a child and then going on to replicate some of those abusive acts that have been inflicted on you as an adult. So I know as well that that's the case with some of the girls who were groomed in northern British towns, that quite a lot of them ended up in the sex industry. So it's kind of all part of the same issue. And I think, when we're looking at the consent and the reason that young women seem to choose the industry, and I would argue they never choose it, it's something that's born of a lack of choice rather than a plurality of choices. You don't look at the men. You don't look at the actions of the men. I mean, whether it's, and I realise it's an imperfect comparison, but whether it's one of the men who signed up to abuse, I would argue abuse women like Lily Phillips on OnlyFans, or whether it's one of the criminal men who abused girls in northern towns. The point is you don't look at their actions, and I feel like there's a real get-out-of-free-jail card, if you like, for the men involved in these cases.
Something that's highlighted in the text also is the disproportionate involvement of certain groups in grooming gangs.
Yeah.
And obviously there's been a lot of silence due to this. How do you foresee the sort of the need for balance, but also accurate reporting of these facts, and still having a fear of the risk of fostering stereotypes or stigmatizing entire communities? Do you see changes in this?
I think there has been. So we had Baroness Faulkner. So she's the head of the Equality and Human Rights Commission. She's the chair. And she wrote an opinion piece yesterday that was very good in the Times, basically calling for a government inquiry. And she is herself of Pakistani origin. I mean, she's British. But, of Pakistani origin, and she's a secular Muslim. And she pointed out, she said what I think it might be very difficult for people who aren't from her background to say, which is, yes, there is a problem. And that actually there are different attitudes within different communities. I mean, that shouldn't really be controversial. And I think, in a way, it's sort of racist to suggest that we don't all deserve the same protections under the law. If you're living in the UK, I don't think it matters what your culture is, what your background is, what your sex is. We should all be subject to the same laws and to the same standards and to the same protections. So I think, in a way, sort of perhaps well-intentioned but stupid fears around racism are indeed themselves racist. We should be able to point out that, yes, it's men, and it's Muslim Pakistani men for the most part. I mean, obviously, there are different demographics involved with all sorts of different crimes. I mean, look at county lines. We know that tends to be predominantly black, but then you look at the paedophiles who go out to Thailand, and that's white men. There are different groups that commit different crimes, but I think by ignoring or by sort of trying to gloss over for the sake of community relations, actually, I think we do everybody a disservice, because we are all better than that.
And there's also, in this text, institutional bias and postmodern ideologies contributing to these failures. Could you explain more about this and how to protect vulnerable children effectively in the future?
Yeah, I think, again, going back to the ideas of consent, and also bringing it back to another scandal that's happened within the UK, which is what's happened at the Tavistock clinic. There's an idea that children can consent, and they can't. But that's something that's actually been pushed, I think, to some degree, with good intentions again, because they would see it as being about empowering children. But actually, I think our job as adults is to lead them. It's to listen to them, sure, but also to lead them and to show them boundaries and to show them love. And I think that's not very fashionable, but that's obviously what's needed to ensure that children are protected. Is, yes, you listen to them, but you're not led by them. So whether they say that, the man who's been giving them free food and lifts and gifts is their boyfriend. No, he isn't. Or whether they say they want to have their breasts removed because they think they're a boy. No, they're not. It's the same sort of lack of leadership by adults in positions of responsibility that lets children down.
Thank you so much, Jo Bartosch, journalist with Words in Spike, The Telegraph, The Times, and assistant editor at The Critic, and also co-writer of the book Pornocracy, for your thoughts.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching Riks Europe.